I had just posted a video a few minutes ago about simple sewing and how if you're concerned about climate change, two tools you can use for sewing are antique machines that are people-powered and not electric-powered, and hand sewing, including embroidery and cross-stitch. Now there's also simple knitting. The point of my simple sewing video was basically you can use scrap fabrics to make insulated curtains, dust covers, table covers, light blocking shades, all kinds of things. Now the knitting version of that, a simple way of doing knitting, involves the authentic knitting board, Zippy Loom. Now these have been out for a few years. They actually, I say they copied me, to tell you the truth. When I was a kid, I had a stick about 2 feet long with screws, and I call that my Nancy stick, Nancy knitting, straight knitting Nancy knitting, and I would make knitting Nancy strands and knit them on the Nancy stick to make fabric. But now they have the Zippy Loom, which is easier than screws or cotter pins, and a bigger gauge. These are about $8 or $9 a piece. They interlock with each other, and they also come, you can buy corners so that you can make them into a square knitting loom. So they basically took my wonderful idea of a knitting Nancy stick and made it commercial, which is great. But there is a secret to these that are wonderful, and it also would be on the ones that I've made myself. It's Rake knitting, basically, and the earliest I can remember having one is like when I was 4. But the reason I mention that is don't let the size and the gauge give you the idea that it's only for kids. So each section is $8 or $9. It's about $30 to buy 4 sections and the corners and corner connectors. Oh, what's the other thing? There's another kind of connector that comes with this set. I have bought a total of 2 sets so that I can take 8 of these and make a long Rake knitter. Each one of these knits about 4 inches wide. So the big, you open the package and the big disadvantage is, oh my gosh, you need super bulky yarn. And then we're talking $8 or $9 a skein, and it's 60 yards to make a hat. And the dollar signs start flipping through your head. Well, this is something that I haven't seen them advertise, but is extremely true with just one section. These are also lucets. So what I'm doing here is luceting worsted weight yarn, and I'll show you how to do that. You basically would hold the strand here to start, wrap it around that peg, wrap it around that peg, and then keep doing that. You end up moving that loose strand down because it falls along the back. And this is luceting. You can hold it sideways. It's a very fast way to loose it. And what this gives you, and I love this little tip, this gives you this gauge yarn. You can see there's my beginning thread, and I tied it in a knot. So you see the yarn that gives you by luceting. And then what this is super bulky. Worsted weight yarn comes in many more colors than super bulky, and worsted weight yarn, this is Red Heart Super Saver Pink, is often on sale, and you can get it a lot cheaper than a super bulky yarn. And this simple trick with their Zippy Loom allows you to bulk up any worsted weight yarn. You could also even go to sport weight like fisherman wool or ice cream yarn by Lion Brand and use 2 strands. And this is so relaxing. It really is to loose it like that. So then, let's say you finished all your loosening. This is the perfect gauge for knitting on these Zippy looms. There would only be the 2 things there. And look at that. So I'm not sure if I did the loosening on a Zippy loom on this one, but this is the fabric you end up with. Now this is 2 of these sections put together, which gave me like 8 inches across, and then when you take it off of there it pulls together a little bit. But this is looseted yarn, which is then knit on 2 sections of the Zippy loom. And this is actually, what I'm calling this, is a painting, a simple yarn painting, Amber Waves of Grain, that I have suction cups, or you can just use floss to loop loops at the top or the top of the bottom. And this can hang on the windows. So I've also made knitted curtains, crocheted curtains, but this, so $9, worsted weight yarn, you bulk up your yarn, and in that case you use 1 section and then you sew sections together to make it as wide as you want it. It's wonderful, and it's very simple large gauge knitting. Now this, my mother, when I was about 18 or 17, my mother made me a beautiful bulky weight sweater coat. And I lost it. I also lost a poncho she made for me, also bulky. And this is a wonderful fabric to make a bulky or a super bulky sweater coat. So clothes, you treat this like fabric. I'm treating it like paintings. I want to do a big one called Earth for climate change. I'm thinking it's going to be 2 feet wide by 3 feet long, which coincidentally fits one of my windows. So I can put my painting, my yarn painting, on my window and do 2 things at once. Completely insulate the window and use it as a light blocker in the summer, and make a painting. And it's all from the one Zippy loom. You can buy the extra sections and do it wide if you want, or you can simply sew sections together. Now the other method I have used to bulk up the yarn is crochet. And I use a pea hook and 3 strands of yarn. I crochet like a whole skein. I'm trying to think if I have any here. And then knit that on the Zippy. But I use the crocheting for rugs because the crochet, it keeps the stitches just a little bit more contained and a little bit more durable for a rug. So the crocheting would be if I were going to make a rug or a rug strip, and the loosening and then knitting is for fabric. Simple knitting. Now I want to show you, this was my first Nancy stick, and as I said, we're really talking about single rake knitting. I also have a complete set of double rake knitting, or knitting board looms, but this is the basics. And when I was a kid, I didn't have screws and everything all the time, so I used pencils. And you can make a knitting rake just like this with pencils. But this is my Nancy stick, and these are 2-inch galvanized iron screws in a garden stake type piece of wood. And I had one of these when I was, I don't know, 3 or 4. And as I said, I would do knitting Nancy strand knitting. This has since been sewn into a bag for the Nancy stick. This goes in there. But this is the fabric that I would make as a child using this type of simple knitting. So now with Zippy coming along, and you can see it was really kind of funny when I've seen them for a couple of years, and I'm like, yeah, I have my own. But you can see the gauge is almost the same that they came up with. And so I've been sitting here saying, oh well, okay, this is an easier knitting Nancy strand knitting tool. But then I picked it up and I was like, oh wow, it's a lucid. Isn't this great? So now, as I said in the video, this is the perfect gauge. And I could also use this gauge on here without using knitting Nancy strands. But we're talking about what Authentic Knitting Board did was take the idea of a single rake knitter, which I call my Nancy stick, and put it into sections, make it modular, and make it have the ability to go into a square. All the things that I struggled with as a kid, they fixed, because when I was a kid, I used to use a weaving loom, like a weave it, for a square knitting loom if I didn't have tools to make 4 sections that would interlock. So things that I was adapting when I was a kid are now on the Zippy loom. And if you decide to use a knitting Nancy strand instead of lucided yarn, this is similar to how the fabric will come out. This was made, that fabric was made on this gauge. So then when you lucid it and you use a Zippy loom, you end up with a bigger gauge looking item, because the luciding is looser than the knitting Nancy strand. But you can really do it either way, and this is perfect for travel, kids to 90 years old. It's so easy to sit there and lucid your yarn, and then you can knit a scarf, you can knit anything, you can knit patches, pot holders, all kinds of stuff. Very simple, basic knitting that does address climate change, because it's an efficient way to use inexpensive, on sale, made in America yarn in order to insulate your life without needing a lot of electricity or highly processed things. Like, I'm sure people that are very wealthy would go to some store and buy super duper insulating room darkening shades at like $50 a shade. And you can do things like that yourself. Now keep in mind, you can use single rake knitting not only with such an easy, super bulky way of doing it, but for all the gauges of knitting. And the one advantage about single rake knitting is that it takes less yarn than typical knitting boards that have 2 rails. This one is sport weight, and I've used cotter pins and an old piece of wood. This is worsted weight, cotter pins, and an old piece of a painting frame, clay, Sculpey clay and cotter pins. That's bulky weight. And this one is worsted weight, 46 stitches. This is equal to like Authentic Knitting Board's all-in-one 18-inch loom. The gauge is different from theirs, and they have 2 rails on that, but with 46 worsted weight stitches. This is about 20 inches long, 19 inches long. What I go by is that can basically be the main panel to the back of a sweater. 20 inches wide would make a sweater panel, and then you can make like 6-inch wide panels for the sides if you need extra width to the sweater. If you're making a cardigan, make 2 panels that are slightly smaller. This width is a good width to start with for making panels, and as I said, in the super bulky weight, sewing strips of things together, and that's where the sewing comes in. And then of course you can just stay with a Knitting Nancy and make your own simple Nancy stick knitter that I already put away. This would be kind of close to it. And if you're using fingering weight yarn, you could use the thinner Knitting Nancy strands on something this gauge. So the Zippy Loom is a really good commercial version of everything you can do by yourself. You need a hand drill and cotter pins and glue. I drill them. I open up the cotter pins usually and then close them again to fit in the hole, but then I add glue. Makes a very sturdy single knitting rake in any gauge you want. This one is thread gauge, and I used finish nails. So you can go from that to something equal to that and make panels of knitting. It's all very simple knitting that is easy, and the advantage to this, which differs a little from fabric and sewing, is you can buy yarn on sale. You can buy fabric on sale too, but the cheapest fabric is usually muslin, and muslin is not really a heavy fabric. So then you're leading into quilting and buying batting and stuff like that. If you can buy inexpensive yarns or yarns on sale and make panels on single rakes, it's a very simple way to make any thickness of fabric and make your own items for the household. Now the last thing I want to show you is that you can go a little bit wild with making rake knitters, and you can use clay, and I've made them in all different gauges. So this is glow-in-the-dark clay and a thread gauge knitter, worsted weight with glow-in-the-dark clay, bulky weight. These would probably be called pocket knitters, and this one is worsted weight, 6 inches wide. You can make a scarf, and this is sport weight. But then we have patches. You can make patches to fix your blankets and stuff. These are all kind of based on 7 stitches, and I have a sample of the knitting with each one so I can tell how far in it's going to go. You can make belts, you can make sashing for knitted items. So I could take one of these and make sashing to go in between panels, sew them together, and all different widths, bulky. And these, a lot of these I made because I had leftover pegs from looms, or so here's a wide one with 2 strands. And it's all simple knitting. It's kind of, in my life, based on Knitting Nancy knitting, where you have 4 stitches on a knitter and you make a round strand. But then when you open that up to straight knitting or rake knitting. And you can make them fancy if you want. Those are rhinestones. All different gauges, and they're fun. It's fun to make them. It's fun to knit with them. They're completely user-friendly and simple. And like this is a thread knitter. So I have commercial ribbons that I've had on my Christmas tree for like over 30 years. I'm going to make 12-inch long ribbons on this one and replace those commercial ribbons with handmade ribbons. This can be a rope, a flat rope that I then tie knots in and give it to the dog as a dog toy. I mean, you can make tons of stuff. And it's all, as I've been saying, simple knitting. Now I guess I should also include, this is what the fabric looks like when you crochet it first and then use the Zippy loom. I have to say that Authentic Knitting Board coming out with the Zippy loom, it's really a much more versatile tool than you would think when you first look at it. This is 3 strands of worsted weight Red Heart Super Saver Cafe Latte, a P hook, crocheted. This is a similar weight. This is actually 6 strands of very light sock weight yarn and a P hook, and that's what the fabric looks. So those are the 2 looks you get with the Zippy loom. Lucided, which, like I said, it's wonderful that you can use the Zippy loom itself to bulk up your worsted weight yarn and save some money on super bulky yarn. But crocheting is an option, and I had this gray left over that I didn't want to make socks with, and now it's a footstool cover. So that's crocheted, and that's lucided. And I just feel that the crochet is a little bit more durable for rugs, and this would be more for a fabric that's not going to get foot traffic. So those are from the Zippy loom, and it's you're adding a step of crocheting or luciding to bulk up your yarn. And if you don't want to do that, then you can just simply stick with correct gauge single knitting rakes and do it that way. But all of this is the same type of really simple knitting because you're going to loop, whether it's big on the Zippy or whether it's thread weight, 2 loops, you knit over and you end up with fabric. I had made a brown panel on my worsted weight loom. Came out beautiful fabric. So it's so easy to do it this way, including if you want to use crochet and make rugs.